He is, of course, former soldier and all-round sage, Brian Belichick. Brian, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. Lots of military news to discuss this evening. I hope you'll forgive me. I'm much taken, as many people are, by the sights and sounds of German panzers burning on the steppe, American Bradleys on fire on the steppe, Canadian military vehicles breaking down on the road to the battlefield. It isn't going so well for NATO, this so-called counteroffensive, is it?
No, it isn't. I just want to say thank you so much for having me on. It's always an honor and a pleasure. So many people have predicted this. Everyone has been saying for months now. I mean, we have been talking about this for months, how NATO's plan of gifting Ukraine another army after they spent their previous military on the fall offensives of last year. They were sending a hodgepodge of equipment that Ukrainian soldiers have never used before. It's not compatible with the other equipment that they were using, used all different types of ammunition, had different logistics, training, and maintenance requirements. Didn't get nearly enough training. People don't understand that incorporating a new weapon system into a military force usually takes years, not a few months. But this is what NATO tried to achieve ahead of this offensive. And now they've launched it. And all during the last 6 months, Russia was not idle. They mobilized 300,000 additional troops to the 200,000 they started the special military operation with. And they dug in layers and layers of fortifications. This offensive is in its second week right now. And they still have not penetrated the security zone, which is the space between Ukrainian and Russian-held territory, where Russia is mounting a mobile defense. And this is before Ukrainian forces have even reached the first Russian actual defensive line.
There's some speculation, Brian, that there are deep divisions at the top of the Ukrainian leadership over the wisdom of this new counteroffensive. Zaluzhny, the defense minister, appears to have literally disappeared. He's not in any pictures. He's not in any video. He's not making any phone calls. In fact, the president, Zelensky himself, spoke with the head of the US military on the phone today. Why would that not be Zaluzhny? Budyanov, the head of intelligence in the Ukrainian state, has literally disappeared. No longer mentioned, no longer on any pictures. Could these things be connected?
It's difficult to say, but surely there must be divisions. Anyone with military experience, the general staff in the Ukrainian military, have to know that a full frontal assault on layered Russian defenses with a hodgepodge of equipment that their troops are inexperienced using, they have to know that this is going to incur huge casualties, loss of equipment with minimal gains. And even if they break through, even if they achieve their objectives, when they reach these objectives, their forces will be exhausted and they will need NATO to transfer over another army's worth of equipment and train up another army's worth of manpower. Surely anyone that understands military matters in Ukrainian armed forces at the higher levels of leadership, they must know this, and they can't be happy signing off on this and doing this in their name, with their name attached to this, in the present and the very real consequences that it'll have, and then in hindsight when people look back on this as a historical event.
Well, there must just be a matter of time before something changes then, because from what I can see, these Ukrainian soldiers are fighting bravely. There's no mass desertion, although there is desertion. These Ukrainian soldiers are still going to the front, even though many of them have been literally press-ganged into the armed forces to do so. But of course, the richest Ukrainians are in Europe right now. They're on the beach, on the deck chair right now. There are millions of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine, including, as I say, almost all of the richest ones, all of the plutocrats, all of the moguls, are all long ago deserted the streets of Ukraine. That doesn't leave all that many to press gang. There must come a point, surely, at which the public turns on their government, or if that is not possible, a group of army officers, perhaps with an eye to the post-war governance of the country, take matters into their own hands, isn't it?
That's always a possibility, although I would say the greatest possibility of all is Ukraine simply running out of equipment and ammunition. NATO is going to be able to supply Ukraine indefinitely with some amount of ammunition and equipment, but the amounts that they need to organize these type of major offensives, the US and Europe, they've exhausted their stockpiles. They're going to be, from this point onward, resorting to what they're able to produce month to month, which, quite frankly, is not a lot. And it's in no way comparable to the amount of ammunition, equipment, and vehicles that the Russian Federation, its military industrial capacity can output. So this is, I think, going to be the primary limiting factor to this conflict. I think NATO will be tempted to enter the conflict directly in one way or another, because precisely what you say, the manpower, you may physically have large numbers of young men that you can still send to the front. You have to train them. And over time, the amount of experienced manpower that you had to wage war with, that diminishes. And that's something you cannot replace in the short term or even intermediate term. These soldiers that are dying now, some of them represent years of experience. That is not easy to replace. You cannot replace that by sending some conscripts to Europe or the United States to train for a few weeks and come back and go onto the battlefield.
What are the forms in which NATO could enter the conflict? They cannot do so under their own charter unless they quickly admitted Ukraine into NATO. This would be vetoed at least by Turkey, but possibly by others too. Maybe even France, which is striking a slightly discordant note on EU and NATO policy these days. President Macron's just asked if he can go as a guest to the BRICS conference in South Africa. So if Ukraine can't join NATO, on what legal basis would NATO be involved in the war?
Well, I don't think that NATO could do anything as an organization. What I think would happen instead, there would be a coalition of the willing, so to speak, organized to enter into Ukraine. And then there's some argument about in what capacity. Would they create a buffer zone in Western Ukraine like the US and its allies created in Eastern Syria? Or would they join in the fighting directly? Would the US decide to throw Poland and the Baltic states in directly into the fighting alongside what's left of Ukraine's military up against Russian forces? And Russia created these defense lines. They mobilized these additional troops, and they've been very conservative with their strategy on the battlefield. And I think the reason they're doing this is because they do anticipate some form of NATO intervention, not NATO officially intervening, but creating some sort of coalition of the willing and sending at least some willing states.
Well, Poland,
yes.
Poland is the most likely candidate for that. It's very odd because the Ukrainian fascists in World War II, in the Holocaust in the East, massacred hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million or more Poles. The hatred, ancient hatred between Poland and Ukraine is palpable. Poland believes that parts of Ukraine, including the great city of Lvov, belong to it, not to Ukraine. Poland has ambitions as an intermare power between the seas. To what do you ascribe the apparent growing love affair between Kiev and Warsaw?
I think the common denominator here is the fact that both nations have a client regime installed into power, reflecting Washington's best interests, not the best interests or histories of their respective countries. So we see Ukraine destroying itself in this proxy war on behalf of Washington, essentially. There's obviously no interest being served for the Ukrainian people. And likewise for Poland. Ukraine had a very large military force at the beginning of the special military operation in February 2022. Poland is right now in the process of building up its military. They have spent huge amounts of money on military equipment from the United States, from South Korea, but this isn't going to be done for years. And even when it is done, their force will be about the same size as Ukraine's at the beginning of the special military operation. So we're looking at another scenario where a nation is about to destroy itself in the fire of a U.S. proxy war. And that is because the regime in power in both of these nations was put there by the United States in one way or the other, and is making decisions that favor the United States at the expense of their respective countries.
Are you surprised, as a former military man, at the poor performance of the German Panzers, the much vaunted Leopard, and the Bradley fighting vehicle? They haven't lasted well.
I'm not surprised at all. As a matter of fact, when they first suggested sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, I pointed out that the Leopard 2 has already seen combat in modern warfare in northern Syria, used by Turkey. And they were used by troops that were properly trained, spent years integrating the Leopard 2 into Turkish military warfare, their way of war. They had combined arms support that Ukraine certainly does not have. They had artillery and air power behind them, and they were still destroyed in northern Syria by irregular militant forces, terrorists, the Kurdish fighters, ISIS, all of these militant groups using anti-tank weapons, missiles. And I said at the time that when they go up against Russian forces, they are going to be going up against troops better trained, better equipped, with all of these anti-tank weapons and much more. And they would be going in with far less support than Turkish soldiers had with their Leopard 2s. Those Leopard 2s were destroyed easily in northern Syria. And we can see the predictable outcome of these Leopard 2s now in Ukraine.
Finally, Brian, a bit of a change of subject. You mentioned terrorists there, and that's what we normally call the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But I saw a piece by you today about a ghastly terrorist attack in Vietnam, in which the United States, Voices of Asia, and their clients in the media market there have never once used the word terrorist. Tell the viewers about that.
This was an attack carried out by an ethnic group in Vietnam. This was an ethnic group that actually sided with the U.S. in its war against the Vietnamese people in the 60s and 70s. They attacked several police stations. I believe there were 9 people killed, and it was obviously a terrorist attack. They used war weapons to carry it out. They killed innocent civilians and bystanders. What else could you call it but a terrorist attack? But U.S. government-funded Radio Free Asia, they wrote an entire article, and from top to bottom, the word terrorism wasn't used once. They even include, right below the headline, something to the effect, well, these people felt oppressed and cheated. And they don't finish the thought. They allow the reader to finish the thought for them. Well, then it's okay, or somehow it's justified. And this is what the U.S. does to sell all of its proxy conflicts, interventions, and terrorist campaigns around the world. This is what this is how they framed the Uyghur extremism in Xinjiang in Western China. It's how they framed the terrorism in Myanmar. It's how they framed the violence here in Thailand, where I'm based. This is a very common pattern, and now it's playing out in Vietnam.
Well, Uyghurs are 0.1% of the population of China. The terrorist element amongst them is 1% of that 0.1%. And yet, The entire world has been told about the Uyghur question in China. No one will be told about that terrorist attack and what comes afterwards in Vietnam. Brian Belichick will always platform you to educate us about these matters. Thank you very much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Brian Belichick of the New Atlas, political analyst, former military officer.